If you stumbled upon a cross in the jungle and suddenly he started talking to you, is that Christian enough? But cutting off the hands of prisoners with a machete, is it a good Catholic tradition? And here's another question. What did the Maya do after their empire fell with the coming of the Europeans? And finally, is it worth forcibly recruiting the poor disenfranchised population into the army? Hello everyone, I am Yeager Ziryanov, and you are on the Redroom channel, where we talk about the dead and the dead, about history. And today sunny Mexico, with its civil wars, endless massacres, Indian uprisings, and a very special attitude to religion, will help us answer all these questions. Let's go. Gaining independence from the hated oppressors is without a doubt a real reason for joy, pride and celebration. And 4 decades of fratricidal civil slaughter. This was fully felt by Mexico, which separated from Spain in 1821 year. As a result of the chaos, pieces of the Mexican pie naturally began to fall off at the edges. For example, Texas managed to be an independent republic before becoming the 28th state. Mexico, during the first 2 decades of freedom, by the way, also consisted of autonomous states, but by the end of the 30s, the new constitution turned it into a unitary state. Not everyone liked it, and in the 39th year, a separatist uprising began on the Yucatan Peninsula, and in the 41st year, the Chamber of Deputies of Yucatan declared the independence of the republic. Mexican President Santa Anna, by the way, watch a separate video about him, sent an army to suppress the uprising. But the inhabitants of Yucatan themselves coped perfectly with the extermination of their own kind. A split immediately appeared within the separatists. The group in the city of Campeche relied on business related to Greater Mexico, and just wanted to preserve their rights in the Mexican state, not intending, in general, to separate. Politicians from the capital of the Katana city of Merida were much more focused on trade with Britain and the United States, and dreamed of complete independence. The war of everyone with everyone had been going on for about 7 years when the governor of Yucatan, and the leader of the Merida clique, Miguel Barbachan, was informed in the 47th year that the Maya Indians had rebelled. If you hear a loud sound, then do not be alarmed. It is the crack of a pattern of thinking that says that the history of the Maya ended with the arrival of white-bearded men in characteristic helmets on the American continent. However, in Yucatan, the relationship between the conquerors and the conquered developed in a rather unexpected way. As one famous, of course, not a scientist and not a historian, but a science fiction writer who studied physics, named Paul Anderson, wrote, "There was not that great confrontation between a hunter and a farmer that forced the Americans to exterminate the Indians. The indigenous peoples of Central America understood quite well what agriculture is and what is life in sucking. So they were simply integrated into the European feudal structure. No, of course, the Spaniards were not kind bunnies, and cruelty after the conquest of America was enough for everyone's eyes and ears. So much so that in the 16th century, even the bishops of New Spain at the next council unanimously came to the conclusion that the Spanish colonists behaved no better than the ancient barbarians and were bandits no less than the local Indians, who, generally speaking, are wild and uneducated pagans, and therefore it is unknown, they say, who else is worse. European diseases and wars not weakly mowed down the population of Central America, but in the end the destruction of Mayan cities and the destruction of local nobility still did not lead to the disappearance of the Mayan people themselves. At the time of the uprising, Indians made up about 80% of the population of Yucatan. The white population, so-called white, because the racial issue there was quite complex, literally concentrated in only 4 cities. The rest of the land belonged to Indian tribes. Of course, by the 19th century, the Maya were no longer the same as before, despite their ethnicity and geographical location. High culture was forgotten, and the legendary pyramids were overgrown with weeds. The Mayan language was translated into Latin back in the 16th century, and as a result, the Maya forgot it so thoroughly that in order to understand what was there in the ancient script, it will take later to the peoples. And since this is still Mexico, they were very interesting Catholics. Initially, when Catholic priests baptized the Maya, they wisely decided that it was possible to preserve some elements of ancient cults by putting the idea in the minds of the flock that these were all emanations of Jesus Christ, So now the rain and corn about Syria is not the miserable rain and chuck corn, but the Apostle James. Well, in general, a typical story about baptism. What is even more typical, these same Indians had accumulated a lot of claims against whites by the 1840s. That under the Spaniards, that under Mexico, that under the independent Republic of Yucatan. The Indians were literally second-class people. Back in colonial times, the Spanish colonies were very fond of creating a complex system of castes that determined the status according to origin. By the Yucatan uprising, everything was simplified, but the castes did not go away. At the top of the food chain were white vecina, that is, neighbors. Initially, this word meant townspeople, but by the 19th century, descendants of European colonists, mestizos, in short, all those who had assimilated European culture began to enter there. They lived in cities, and they had all the rights they were supposed to have. Below in the hierarchy were blacks, by the way, not slaves, Chinese migrant workers. And at the very bottom, there were Indians. If the hairdryers had all the normal civil rights, then the Indians would not even be allowed to choose their clothes. They had to wear white shirts, white trousers, and hats made of palm leaves. Sombreros are only for white gentlemen here. There was one life hack that allowed some Indians to become Bessie, us, wrote about it in the cart, by the way. Subscribe to our Telegram channel. In any case, first of all, the Indian tribes were very much limited by the social status of the Indians. As a result, these same tribes remained at a rather primitive level of development. They continued to engage in slash-and-burn agriculture. They burned out the selva and planted corn on the fire. Because of this, we had to change the fields every 3 years. Secondly, the restrictions were imposed by the Indian traditions themselves. It was believed that writing was practically a sacred occupation, accessible only to priests and special scribes. And Maya wasn't particularly interested in other education. You never know what these white devils will whisper in our children's ears. And the white devils themselves, to be honest, did not seek to educate the Indians, but they will learn arithmetic. And then they will start counting how much money they pay white gentlemen there. That's not the case. Indian communities were governed by pigtail chiefs, who actually took their place by collecting taxes. Tithing in favor of the Catholic Church and a secular tax to the treasury of the Republic, the so-called personal contribution. Probably, they wanted to add the word voluntary, but somehow they were too shy. The Indians also lacked land very much. The above-mentioned burning of fields forced to constantly change the place of arable land. In addition, back in the 30s, local authorities allowed white aristocrats to clear the jungle and organize haciendas on lands that actually belonged to Indian communities. And finally, modern medicine was suddenly to blame. Back in 1803–1806, the Spaniards organized a large-scale vaccination campaign against smallpox in their colonies, under the very curtain of the empire. As a result, the Indian population of Yucatan doubled in a few decades, and all these people needed something to eat, somewhere to live and somewhere to work. The final chord in this song Madness was the decision of the authorities of independent Yucatan to recruit beggars, disenfranchised and often half-starved Indians into the army. The brilliant idea of the commander of the separatist troops at first even turned into some kind of success. Indian soldiers really helped them in a number of cases to cope with government troops. But 7 years have passed, and it turned out that training a huge number of Indians, giving them modern weapons, and at the same time continuing to treat them like dirt under their nails is not the wisest strategic decision. The first riots began already in the 43rd, but in the 47th year, the situation escalated to the limit. Valladolid, there was a rumor that one authoritative cacique Manuel Antonio Ai, the Maya have Spanish names, and the surnames sound monosyllabic, almost like the Chinese. So, there was a rumor that he was preparing an uprising. It is unclear whether he actually prepared it, but according to the laws of wartime, Senor Aya was promptly shot. The prophecy, as usual, turned out to be self-fulfilling. As a reaction, a real uprising began. A detachment led by Cacique Sebastian Che entered the town of Tipich and simply slaughtered all whites there, including women and children. In response, a punitive detachment from Valladolid came, and this time slaughtered all the redskins in the vicinity. There was no stopping the carnage now. The rebels dreamed of throwing all the whites into the sea, that is, exterminating the entire white population of Yucatan, and not paying taxes, and in principle, This is an exhaustive political program. For the first few months, the uprising was small, and therefore no attention was paid to it. Well, that's why it soon became large, and the Maya captured Valladolid, one of the largest cities, where, in fact, the white population was concentrated. This very population fled to the capital Merida, and on the road, it stretched into a huge column, which was constantly attacked by Indians who staged mass executions of prisoners. The apathy of the authorities was replaced by panic. The capital began to be fortified, and the governor of Barbican even wrote a letter to the President of the United States, with a request to send troops to the peninsula, hinting that he was even ready to annex Yucatan to the United States, if only they would solve the problem with the Indians. If anything, at that time the United States was just waging war with Mexico. By the way, this issue was actually put up for discussion in Congress, but it ended in nothing. The congressman did not want to expand the war on Yucatan, so Barbican had to go to Mexico City and ask for help already there from his own enemies from the central government, and he really even allocated troops there. But in the end, they weren't really needed. The rebel armies stopped 50 kilometers from Merida and left. The sowing campaign began, and the peasants simply returned to their fields, having scored on some kind of uprising there. In the same way, the Katani troops recaptured their territories, almost without resistance. In this style, the war went on for several more years. Then one side advanced, then the other, but in fact, the peninsula became divided into two parts. And in general, this conflict was quite strange. There were no two armies that opposed each other. On the Maya side, there were separate rebel detachments that followed their commanders. On the government side, there were mobile guard detachments, which also operated mostly autonomously. There are no general battles or fronts, only skirmishes, raids and raids. It was more like a gang or cartel war than a war in the European classical sense. By the way, about the European understanding, do not imagine this war as a conflict between white-skinned space marines and stupid primitive orc Indians, armed only with spears and tomahawks. There were veterans of past civil wars in the ranks of the Maya. They tried to create a modern military organization and adopt some European tactics. Well, they more than compensated for the lack of skill in this with the ability to conduct a guerrilla war in the jungle. There, government troops, in theory much better trained and armed, suddenly turned out to be quite helpless, because the mode of hooky in the trees was turned on. Well, since napalm in the 19th century, along with helicopters, had not yet been invented, the government troops, having wandered into the jungle, suffered from the Indians there even more. It lasted year after year, and was accompanied by a complete tin on both sides. The whites killed the reds killed the whites, just like in Russia, after the 17th year. Historians estimate the total number of victims of this war at 300,000 people over 50 years. And given the scale of Yucatan, this is a lot. For example, in 1848th year, government troops recaptured the city of Tekash from May. All the captured rebels were driven to the second floor of the town hall, soldiers lined up below, and the Indians began to be thrown off one by one on bayonets. In the same 48th year, a law was passed that 4 Mayans with weapons were already an insurgent detachment, and a court-martial with an obvious outcome had already been laid for this. The war was brutal. The authorities of Yucatan, where slavery was actually prohibited, at some point began selling prisoners to Cuba, where most of them were simply worked on plantations to death. The Maya acted, well, about like Thanos. They simply killed the first half of the prisoners with a machete, and sent the other half to work. Moreover, if you were a white and educated prisoner, then you could even have good prospects. For example, you could get a job as a clerk or some kind of secretary there. There was a funny story about how one of the Mayan commanders arranged for such a white prisoner to be his personal secretary at headquarters. And it ended, of course, with the prisoner escaping. An independent choice was given only to the captive priest. Either you start casting bulls on us for free, or they cut off your head with a machete. The majority, as you understand, agreed to the first option, because, apparently, the second point could be interpreted as suicide. It's actually a terrible sin. However, seriously speaking, the Julian clergy probably did not think about sins, because they, in principle, had a special reputation. Priests openly lived with housekeepers who gave birth to their children. This was such a frequent case that the locals simply did not trust lonely priests. A typical case was a personal harem, and sermons were held so rarely, usually only during Lent and Holy Week. that a law had to be passed prohibiting priests from absenteeism. So the only thing that could have prevented the local clergy from switching to the Indian side was racism, which was easily suppressed by the fear of death. By the way, the Maya treated only whites so harshly. They also considered blacks victims, and they considered Chinese migrant workers to be the same as Indians, and tried to recruit them into the army, however, without much success. All this was accompanied by famine, the devastation of villages and lands, and, of course, the cholera epidemic. By the beginning of the 50s, the atmosphere of the end of time reigned, and, probably, in this context, many had already begun to hope for the victory of the Yucatan government troops, if only just to stop the general madness. Yes, and this country seemed to have more chances. After all, it was the state. But the apocalypse is always accompanied, you know, by magic, miraculous phenomena. And here, such a wonderful phenomenon was the discovery of a special force that was able to unite all the Maya together. And its name is the cult of talking crosses. No, the madness doesn't stop at this name, don't even think about it. At the end of 1850th year, a certain Jose Maria Barrera, a mestizo soldier from the government garrison, defected to May. His mother was gay, and he also considered himself a Maya. On the way in a forest stream, according to legend, he found a talking cross. This cross told him that he was the Holy Trinity, sent down to earth by God in order to lead and protect Christian peoples. And by Christian peoples, of course, only the Maya Indians were meant. There was nothing doubtful about the cult of magical Maya artifacts. Their Catholicism was a vigorous mixture of Christianity and paganism, so what is a talking cross? Well, yes, why not? It perfectly fit into the ritual traditional practices of the Indians. To heighten the effect, Barrera found an Indian ventriloquist, with whom they began to preach together, and were extremely successful in this. The news of the newly revealed miracle spread through the surrounding Indian settlements. A cult began to grow around the cross. The cultists founded the city of Chan Santa Cruz, the current Filipe Carrillo Porta. The name, by the way, literally translates as a small holy cross, and in honor of that very cross. In honor of the same cross, a temple was built in the city, and gradually various rebel commanders began to unite around it. In response, already in the next 51st year, the government mobile guard raided the Santa Cruz vat. And then they really managed to suddenly attack, burn the sanctuary, and even kill the ventriloquist himself. But it was impossible to hold the city behind the rebels for a long time, so they simply burned it and retreated. Barrera was able to escape, and in a matter of months, a new sanctuary appeared in Chan Santa Cruz. And not just a sanctuary, in 1860. They managed to build a real, well, a cathedral in the colonial style, only dedicated not to the Virgin Mary or any saints, but 2 crosses. Yes, there were 3 crosses now instead of 1, and Barrera called them the children of the first cross. It's a little strange, but if crosses can talk, then why can't they give birth? Moreover, perhaps in this case, they multiplied by budding or something else. Yes, instead of a ventriloquist, Barrera came up with an excellent scheme at all. When a person entered the temple, he saw these 3 crosses, dressed in ceremonial traditional May women's dresses. Well, as they say, how from Gad, she's black. There was a curtain behind the crosses, and behind the curtain, there was a barrel dug in. In it sat a boy, usually the son of the high priest, and spoke on behalf of the crosses. The acoustics were arranged in such a way that it was almost impossible to understand the source of the sound. Well, thank God, they did without a false nose, as in that series of Samurai Champloo. They say that this trick worked very effectively. But the Katana army did not give up, and in 1860 a new expedition was sent. And this time everything went strange. The government troops actually prepared very well. 2,500 people, well armed, with guns and so on, moved into the Santa Cruz vat, but found nothing there. And no one, literally. It was like there was nothing there at all, except for the gutted wells, so in a sense. These guys were even worse off than Napoleon in Moscow. The government troops began to withdraw, and at that moment, they hit from the Mayan jungle under him. And out of 2,500 people returned home to 600. Meanwhile, the veneration of crosses developed into a full-fledged religion. The priests proclaimed that in general all crosses have magical properties, except, perhaps, suddenly, the body ones. Therefore, in the territory controlled by Maya, each city, village and each clan had their own crosses and their own prophets. And around all this, most importantly, the state began to build. The ruler of Chan Santa Cruz became, as it were, the main commander of all rebel detachments. In 1857th year, such a ruler named Venancio Pac or Peck, he is pronounced differently, created something like a state hierarchy. He declared himself, in Mayan, Tatic or Tatic, the defender of the crosses, that is, the supreme ruler of all the Maya Yucatan. Well, more precisely, the viceroy of such a ruler, because the Lord God himself was considered the real supreme ruler. That is, yes, a cross, or rather crosses. In general, these guys had a lot of show-offs. One of these, Toddy, in the 50s, called himself the progenitor of all Christians, the son of the Lord God, and, in general, almost Jesus Christ himself. A certain Tadanats was responsible for the spiritual part. I do not know how it reads in Mayan, I'm sorry. This is the high priest and, by the way, the father of the very kid, who was supposed to be sitting in a barrel. There were also ministers of crosses. This is the leader of individual populations, and the captains of individual companies, into which these very settlements were divided. In general, something strange happened at the junction of the Christian theocracy and the military dictatorship. And naturally, there was even an attempt to create something like a regular army, the so-called Holy Guard, which was subordinate to the ministers of the crosses and served as garrisons of settlements. With real centralization and subordination, the whole project was not that good, but its originality, I must say, is still very striking. In the 60s, a balance as fragile as the glass of a newly purchased smartphone was established. The west of the peninsula was controlled by whites, the southeast by Indians. And this status quo managed to be maintained right up to the 80s, largely, by the way, thanks to the help of British smugglers. In fact, the Maya have been asking the British and other states for recognition since the beginning of the war, but they have not received any official response. Anyway, in the 80s, active military operations practically ceased, and the border zone was overgrown with selva. We can say that the rebellious Indians won. For the first time since the conquest, an independent Maya state appeared on the American continent. It sounds great and cool in general, but there are nuances. In fact, the eastern regions of Yucatan, which were under the control of the Santa Cruz Chan, are not fertile lands, where even the ancient Maya did not go much for this reason. In addition, this region is cut off from all potential trade routes, except for the sea. But for maritime trade, recognition is needed, which never happened. Only English smugglers have been trading since May. As a result, the Maya in these territories, having won their freedom, paid a huge price for it, being, in fact, on the verge of extinction. We do not have exact figures, but according to scientists' estimates, the number of Maya has decreased very quickly, by as much as 5 times over the years of independence. By the beginning of the 20th century, there were no more than 10,000 Indians living in Chan Santa Cruz. At the same time, the western part of the peninsula was experiencing an economic upswing at that moment. Yucatan, yes, lost its independence after all and returned to Mexico as one of the richest states. Henequen, a variety of agave, from which hemp is made for ropes, began to be grown en masse there. An exceptionally valuable material in the world before the invention of artificial fibers. Electric lighting, a wonderful theater, a symphony orchestra, and other cultural jokes appeared in Merida. In short, the authorities of Yucatan at some point did not have until May at all, and those, in theory, could have continued to exist in attempts not to die out, but events in Greater Mexico changed everything. In 1876 year, President Porfirio Diaz came to power there. A dictator who ruled for more than 30 years and imprisoned his opponents right during the election campaign, whose name in modern Mexico is still in fact cursed and erased from the culture. However, at the same time, many people generally agreed to a dictatorship. Even such stability seemed to many to be something not the worst against the background of decades of civil wars, with a break for foreign intervention. And, as usual, Diaz decided not only to ensure stability, but also to engage in, land gathering, including dealing with the Maya enclave in Yucatan. In 1893, Diaz concluded a treaty with Great Britain, according to which now Chan Santa Cruz was considered the territory of Mexico. Characteristically, Maya, of course, no one asked. And so, when the National Mexican Army took over, things went differently. The Mexican commander, General Bravo, did the smart thing and began building a railway from Valladolid to Chan Santa Cruz. We tried to resist, but it was in the 1850s, their weapons were not inferior to modern ones. And 40 years of technological lag is, a lot. Chan Santa Cruz slept in 1901, and, in theory, this is usually the end of the history of the caste war. Although, in fact, the Civil War lasted for another 15 years or so. And in total, this entire conflict takes a period of time of 68 years. It's not enough for a second. The most interesting thing here is that Diaz suddenly proved to be a smart person and did not return the Maya territories to the control of the Yucatan authorities, despite the fact that they, generally speaking, demanded it. Instead, federal administration was introduced on the lands of the former Chan Santa Cruz, and since 1974. This is the state of Mexico, Quintana Roo. By the way, the name has nothing to do with Maya. It is the surname of a diplomat who, back in the early 19th century, negotiated the return of Yucatan to Mexico, so the modern Maya have their own autonomy. Yes, within the framework of Mexico, and within the framework of federal legislation, but nevertheless, a lot of traditions and customs in Quintana Roo have remained unchanged. Even the heads of rural communities are still called captains. So the attempt in the 19th century to create an independent Indian state, of course, failed. But whether the Maya themselves lost or gained from, this is an interesting question. And, in any case, we observe the legacy of these times to this day. We wish the Maya Indians that everything remains good for them, and the same, and even more. And we wish the best to those who support this channel on Boost and on Patreon. I remind you that you can also do this with a Russian card on Boost or a foreign card on Patreon. There you can watch our videos the very first, do it without advertising, and communicate with us in our special Telegram chats. In any case, subscribe to the channel, like this video if you were interested, and write comments just because you need to write comments. Does YouTube like it? Is that what you want, really? Why do I have to say it at all every time? In any case, after this video, we will take a break for a couple of weeks, and we will have a vacation now, do not worry. We will not disappear anywhere, and we will return with new videos in January. Have a nice new year to everyone. And that, to be honest, was the end of me.